candle on the desk had burned down to almost nothing, and the letter in Edmund Ashcombe's shaking hand was the last order he would ever give as a well man. Outside his bedroom window, the fields of Ashcombe stretched dark and silent under a sky heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. Inside, the air smelled of medicine and old paper, and the Duke's chest rose and fell with an effort that frightened everyone who heard it. "Send for my niece," he said. "Send for Eleanor. Tonight." Mr. Price, the butler, stood by the door with his hands folded, unwilling to argue with a dying man, yet unable to hide the doubt on his face. "Your Grace, the young men from London are already on their way. Mr. Pemberton has arranged for a proper steward, a man with experience." "I do not want a proper steward," the Duke said, his voice thin but sharp enough to cut through the room. "I want someone who will not steal from me while I am too weak to stop them. Bring Eleanor." 3 days earlier, the Duke had discovered the truth that no one else in the house dared to speak aloud. Gerald Finch, his steward of 11 years, a man he had trusted with every account book and every harvest report, had been quietly bleeding the estate dry. Loans taken against future crops, payments recorded that were never made, tenants charged twice for repairs that were never finished. The Duke had found it only by accident, flipping through an old ledger while too sick to sleep, and the shock of it had very nearly stopped his heart on the spot. Now Ashcombe owed more money than it could hope to earn in 3 good harvests. Creditors were already writing letters. Neighboring landowners, especially the ambitious Lord Harcourt, were watching with open interest, waiting for the estate to fail so they could buy up its best land for almost nothing. And the Duke, who had once commanded armies of servants and thousands of acres with nothing more than a raised eyebrow, could not even walk to the window without help. He thought of his brother's daughter. Eleanor Whitmore had grown up not in grand halls but on a small farm 2 counties away, the only child of a man who had taught her to read numbers before she could properly read books. When her father died, she had taken over the farm herself at 19, refusing every suitor who offered to manage it for her, and had somehow kept it profitable through 2 bad winters and 1 terrible flood. The Duke had visited only once, years ago, and had never forgotten the sight of her standing in a muddy field, arguing calmly with a merchant twice her age about the price of grain, and winning. She was, by every rule of the world he lived in, the wrong choice. She was young, she was unmarried, she was a woman. The lawyers would object, his own family would object louder. But Edmund Ashcombe had run out of time to care what anyone thought was proper. He needed someone honest, and he needed someone quick, and Eleanor Whitmore was both. The letter went out that night, carried by a rider who did not stop to rest his horse. Eleanor received it 2 days later, standing in her own small kitchen, with flour still on her hands from the morning's baking. She read it twice before she understood what it was truly asking. Her uncle, a man she had met only a handful of times in her whole life, wanted her to leave her farm and come manage an estate 50 times its size, an estate that was, according to the letter, drowning in debt with harvest only a few months away. "He wants me to be his steward," she said quietly, to no one but herself. Her neighbor, an older woman named Alice Combe, who had come by to trade eggs for bread, raised her eyebrows so high they nearly vanished into her bonnet. "A steward? You? Eleanor, that is a man's job. A grand estate like Ashcombe will have lawyers and clerks who have done nothing else their whole lives. What makes the Duke think you can do what they cannot?" "Because they are the ones who let it fall apart," Eleanor said, folding the letter carefully. "Or worse, they are the ones who broke it on purpose." She did not sleep well that night. She sat by her small fire, turning the decision over and over, weighing the farm she had built with her own hands against the frightening size of what her uncle was asking. If she failed at Ashcombe, she would lose nothing of her own, only her uncle's respect and whatever she had risked to try. But if she refused, and the estate collapsed into ruin, hundreds of tenant families would lose their homes, their fields, and their futures. She thought of her own father, and how frightened she had been the first time she balanced a ledger alone after his death, certain she would ruin everything. She had not ruined it, she had saved it. By morning, her mind was made up. She packed only what she needed, arranged for a trusted neighbor to watch her farm, and set out for Ashcombe Hall with nothing but a small trunk, a head full of numbers, and a determination that she kept mostly to herself. The journey took 2 full days, and by the time her carriage rolled up the long gravel drive toward the great house, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, threatening rain that still refused to fall. Ashcombe Hall was larger than anything she had ever stood in front of, its stone walls rising 3 floors high, its windows dark and watchful, like the eyes of something ancient and tired. She stepped down from the carriage with her chin lifted, refusing to let the size of the place shake her resolve, though her stomach turned uneasily all the same. Mr. Price met her at the door, his expression polite but unreadable. "Miss Whitmore, the Duke is expecting you, though I must warn you, he is very unwell." "Take me to him," she said simply. The Duke's bedroom was warm and dim, and the man lying in the great bed looked nothing like the proud figure Eleanor remembered from her childhood visits. His face was thin, his hair gone almost entirely white, and his hands, resting on top of the blankets, trembled slightly, even in stillness. But his eyes, when they found her, were sharp and clear, and Eleanor understood in that moment that whatever illness had taken his body, it had not yet touched his mind. "Eleanor," he said, and something like relief passed over his face. "You came. You asked me to, Uncle. I could hardly refuse a man in your condition." A faint, tired smile crossed his lips. "You could have refused easily enough. Most would have. Sit down, please. I do not have the strength to explain this twice, so listen carefully." She sat in the chair beside his bed, and for the next half hour, the Duke told her everything. The debts, the false records, Gerald Finch's betrayal, uncovered too late to undo, but perhaps not too late to survive. He told her about the creditors circling like crows, about Lord Harcourt's suspicious interest in Ashcombe land, and about his own family, who he suspected would rather sell off pieces of the estate quietly than fight to save it whole. "I am naming you acting steward," he said, when he had finished. "Effective tonight, you will have full authority over the accounts, the tenants, the staff, everything, until harvest is brought in and the immediate debts are settled. If you succeed, I will make the position permanent, whatever anyone says about it. If you fail—" He paused, and his eyes grew distant. "If you fail, I fear there will be no Ashcombe left to argue over." Eleanor's heart pounded, but her voice, when she answered, was steady. "And if your family objects, Mr. Pemberton, the other stewards you were sending for?" "They will object loudly," the Duke said. "You must be prepared for that. Pemberton is not a bad man, but he is a cautious one, and cautious men do not trust what they have not seen before. As for my family, my nephew Edgar in particular will not be pleased. He has always believed the estate should pass more directly through the male line, and he will see your appointment as an insult, to be corrected as soon as possible." "Then I will simply have to prove myself faster than they can object," Eleanor said. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his tired face eased, as though a great weight had shifted, even if it had not yet lifted entirely. "That," he said softly, "is exactly what I was hoping you would say." He called for Mr. Price, and in a voice made weak by illness, but strong with purpose, he gave the order that would upend the entire household by morning. Eleanor Whitmore, his niece, was to be treated as acting steward of Ashcombe Estate, with full authority over every ledger, every field, and every decision, until further notice. Mr. Price's face remained composed, but Eleanor did not miss the flicker of surprise, and something close to worry, that crossed it before he bowed and left to spread the news. That night, Eleanor was given a small room near the estate offices rather than one of the grand guest chambers, a detail she suspected was less about hospitality and more about where the staff believed she truly belonged. She did not mind. She had never cared much for grand rooms. What she cared about was the stack of ledgers she had glimpsed through the open door of the estate office as she passed, thick leather books that likely held the true story of Ashcombe's ruin, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to read them honestly. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the old house creak and settle around her, thinking of the debts, the tenants, the harvest that was still months away, and the many people who would wake tomorrow, already hoping she would fail. Somewhere out in the darkness, thunder finally rumbled, low and distant, as though the sky itself understood that everything at Ashcombe was about to change. By the time the first gray light touched the windows, Eleanor was already dressed and moving through the halls, notebook in hand, determined to see every corner of the estate before anyone had the chance to hide anything from her. She passed servants who stopped mid-step to stare, and a young stable hand named Daniel Foss who nearly dropped a bucket of water when he realized who she was. "You're truly the new steward, then?" he asked, before quickly adding, "Begging your pardon, miss, for asking so plainly." "I am," Eleanor said, "for now, at least. And I would rather you ask plainly than whisper behind my back, Daniel. I imagine there will be enough of that already." He gave a small, surprised laugh, the first honest sound she had heard since arriving. "I imagine there will indeed, miss." She continued on toward the estate office, where a locked door and a stack of untouched ledgers waited for her, holding within them every secret that had brought Ashcombe to the edge of ruin. She did not yet know the full size of what she would find inside, nor how deep the betrayal ran, nor how many enemies her uncle's decision had just created in a single night. But she knew this much for certain: the Duke had given her a task most people believed impossible, and whatever waited behind that locked door, she intended to face every page of it herself. As she reached for the door handle, she heard footsteps approaching quickly from behind, sharp and hurried, the sound of someone clearly displeased and coming to say so. She turned to find a tall, well-dressed man striding toward her, his face tight with barely controlled anger. And she understood at once, before a single word was spoken, that her first real battle at Ashcombe was about to begin. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," the man said coldly, stopping just short of her. "I am Mr. Pemberton, solicitor to the Ashcombe estate for the past 20 years. I would very much like to know what exactly you believe you are doing here." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, her hand still resting on the office door. "I believe, Mr. Pemberton, that I am about to save this estate. Would you care to help me, or would you prefer to stand in my way?" The question hung in the cold morning air between them, and for a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Mr. Pemberton did not step aside. He stood squarely in front of the office door, his arms folded, his expression the kind that had likely won him 100 arguments in courtrooms and drawing rooms alike. "I have served this family faithfully for 2 decades, Miss Whitmore. I do not intend to stand aside simply because a dying man, in a moment of desperation, made a decision that defies every sensible practice this estate has ever followed. The dying man is my uncle," Eleanor said calmly, "and the estate he built is currently drowning in debt that his previous steward created. A steward you yourself approved and trusted for 11 years. If sensible practice is what brought Ashcombe to ruin, perhaps it is time for something different." His jaw tightened. "You are a farmer's daughter. I am the daughter of a man who kept his farm profitable through 2 failed harvests and a flood that destroyed half the county's crops. I did the same for 3 years after he died. I know numbers, Mr. Pemberton, better than most men who learned them only from books." For a moment, he seemed almost impressed, despite himself, though he quickly hid it behind a fresh wave of irritation. Knowing numbers on a small farm is not the same as managing thousands of acres, dozens of tenants, and debts owed to some of the most powerful creditors in the county. "Then help me understand the difference," Eleanor said, "instead of simply telling me I cannot. Or step aside and let me see the ledgers myself, and we shall discover together whether I am capable." He studied her for a long moment, clearly searching for another argument and failing to find one strong enough. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stepped to the side. "The Duke has given his order. I cannot undo it, much as I might wish to. But understand this, Miss Whitmore. I will be watching every decision you make, and the moment I see you leading this estate toward greater ruin, I will bring it before every relative and every creditor this family has." "Good," Eleanor said, pushing the door open at last. "Then we want the same thing, Mr. Pemberton. We simply disagree on how likely I am to succeed." Inside, the estate office was a cold, high-ceilinged room, lined with shelves of ledgers, some so old their leather covers had cracked with age. Dust hung in the morning light streaming through a tall window, and the smell of old paper and dried ink filled the air. Eleanor felt, standing there, the way she imagined a soldier might feel, walking onto a battlefield for the first time, aware that everything she did in the coming hours would shape everything that followed. She began with the most recent ledgers, working backward through the months, and within an hour, her stomach had turned cold with understanding. The numbers were worse than her uncle's letter had suggested. Loans had been taken not once but repeatedly, each one used partly to pay the interest on the last, a trap that grew tighter with every season. Payments to tenants for repairs were recorded as complete, yet when she cross-referenced the dates with letters from the tenants themselves, tucked into a separate drawer, She found complaints about roofs never fixed and fences never mended, dated months after the payments were supposedly made. By midday, Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper, appeared at the office door with a tray of tea and bread, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had decided to wait and watch before choosing a side. "The Duke asked that you eat something, miss. He worries you will forget, buried in those books." "Thank you, Mrs. Bramwell," Eleanor said, setting down her pen and rubbing her tired eyes. "Tell me honestly, since you have worked here far longer than I have breathed this house's air, did no one notice what Mr. Finch was doing?" Mrs. Bramwell hesitated, glancing back toward the hallway before answering quietly. "There were whispers, miss. A tenant here or there complaining that promised repairs never came, but Mr. Finch was clever. He always had an explanation ready, and the Duke trusted him completely. Questioning him felt like questioning the Duke himself, and few of us dared to do that." "And now," Eleanor asked, "now that Mr. Finch is gone and the truth is spilling out of every ledger in this room?" "Now," Mrs. Bramwell said, "I suppose we shall see what kind of steward you truly are, miss. Words are easy. Numbers on a page are easy enough for those who understand them. It is what you do with the truth that will matter." Eleanor nodded slowly, turning the words over in her mind long after the housekeeper had gone. She spent the rest of the day deep in the ledgers, tracing every strange payment, every unexplained loan, building a picture in her notebook that grew clearer and more troubling with every page. By evening, she understood the shape of the disaster well enough to know that numbers alone would not save Ashcombe. She needed to understand the people the numbers represented, the tenants whose complaints had gone unheard for years, the creditors whose patience was clearly wearing thin, and the family members who might, even now, be working against her without her knowledge. She found her uncle awake that evening, propped up against a mountain of pillows, a small oil lamp casting warm light across his tired face. "You look like a woman who has read more numbers in one day than most men read in a month," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I have found things that trouble me greatly, Uncle," Eleanor said, sitting beside his bed. "The debts are worse than your letter suggested, and I do not believe Mr. Finch acted entirely alone." The Duke's smile faded, replaced by something more guarded. "Explain." "Several of the largest loans were arranged through a lender connected to Lord Harcourt's estate. The terms are unusually harsh, almost designed to fail, with penalties that grow sharply if payments are even slightly late. It is the kind of arrangement a careless steward might sign without understanding, or the kind a corrupt one might sign on purpose, knowing exactly what it would do to Ashcombe over time." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "Harcourt has wanted the eastern fields of this estate for 15 years. I refused to sell when he asked plainly. If he could not buy the land honestly, perhaps he found another way to take it." "That is what I fear," Eleanor said quietly. "Which means saving Ashcombe will not simply mean balancing books. It may mean facing a man who has been working against this family for years, quietly, patiently, waiting for exactly this moment." The Duke reached out and took her hand, his grip weaker than she remembered from her childhood, yet still carrying something steady and certain within it. "Then it is fortunate, Eleanor, that I did not choose a steward who frightens easily." She managed a small, tired smile, though inside her, the weight of what she had uncovered pressed heavier with every passing hour. She excused herself soon after, walking back through the darkened halls toward her small room, and along the way, she passed an open sitting room, where several voices carried out into the corridor, low and urgent, clearly not meant for her ears. She paused just outside the door, recognizing one voice as Mr. Pemberton's, careful and clipped as always. The second voice belonged to a younger man, sharp with barely restrained frustration. "She has been here one day," the younger voice said, "and already she is tearing through ledgers that took Finch years to build. If she uncovers everything, it will not only ruin Finch's name, it will drag every decision Uncle Edmund made in the last decade into question, including the ones concerning me." "Calm yourself, Edgar," Pemberton replied. "The Duke's illness clouds his judgment. This appointment cannot last. The moment she fails, or the moment your uncle is no longer able to protect her position, we shall have grounds to remove her and place someone more suitable in charge, someone who understands how these matters are properly handled." Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor, her heart pounding, understanding now, with painful clarity, that her uncle's own nephew, a man who stood to inherit should anything happen to the Duke, was already working against her. perhaps even before she had crossed the estate's front gates. She did not know yet how deeply Edgar Ashcombe's ambitions ran, nor whether he had any part in Finch's schemes, but she understood that from this moment forward, every step she took would be watched by people hoping desperately for her to stumble. She continued on to her room, without revealing that she had heard a word, her mind racing through everything she now knew, and everything she still needed to learn. The debts, the suspicious loans tied to Harcourt, a steward who had vanished the moment his crimes were nearly discovered, a cousin eager for her failure, a solicitor who trusted none of it. Lying in her narrow bed that night, staring up at the dark ceiling, Eleanor allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full size of what she had taken on. Then she pushed the fear aside, the way she had learned to do standing in her own muddy fields years ago, arguing with merchants who believed a young woman could be easily dismissed. She had proven them wrong once. She intended to prove Ashcombe's doubters wrong as well, one honest page at a time, however many enemies that honesty might create along the way. Tomorrow, she decided, she would leave the estate office behind for a few hours and ride out to see the tenant farms herself, to hear directly from the people whose lives depended on decisions made in rooms they were never invited into. The ledgers had told her what had happened to Ashcombe's money. The tenants, she suspected, would tell her something the numbers alone never could, the true cost of years of neglect, and perhaps, if she listened carefully enough, the first real clue toward setting it right before the harvest ran out of time. Rain finally broke over Ashcombe just before dawn, drumming against the office window, while Eleanor sat surrounded by candles and ledgers, stacked so high they blocked her view of the door. She had been awake since well before the household stirred, chasing a single strange entry that refused to make sense no matter how many times she read it. A payment of a considerable sum, recorded as going to a company she had never heard of, dated 3 days before Gerald Finch had disappeared from the estate entirely. She dipped her pen and wrote the company's name in her notebook, underlining it twice. Price had told her the previous evening that Finch left in the night, taking almost nothing with him, as though he had planned his departure carefully and long in advance. A man who stole quietly for years did not usually vanish in a panic unless something, or someone, had warned him his time was running short. The rain eased into a steady patter, and Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes, forcing herself to look again at the pattern she had begun to notice, buried across dozens of pages. Loans taken from a lender in the nearby town, always in amounts just below the figure that would require a second signature from the Duke himself. Repairs recorded as paid-for tenant cottages that, according to letters from the tenants filed in a separate drawer, had never been touched at all, and running through nearly every large transaction, like a thread stitched carefully out of sight, the name of the same company, Halden and Fenwick, Land and Finance. She had never heard of it before arriving at Ashcombe, yet its name appeared no fewer than 14 times, across 3 years of ledgers, always in connection with the largest and most damaging loans on the estate's books. She made a note to ask Mr. Pemberton about it, though she suspected, given his loyalty to the old ways of doing things, that he might already know more than he had chosen to share. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Bramwell entered carrying a folded letter, her expression tight with something Eleanor had not yet learned to read clearly. "This arrived for you, miss, by private messenger, not through the usual post." Eleanor took the letter and broke the plain wax seal, and as she read the few lines within, her stomach tightened with a cold, unpleasant certainty. The letter was brief and carefully polite, written in an elegant hand that gave nothing away, yet its meaning was unmistakable. It came from Lord Harcourt himself, expressing his sincere hope that the new steward of Ashcombe would find her responsibilities manageable, and offering, should matters prove too difficult, to discuss a fair and generous purchase of certain eastern fields that had, in his words, long been a burden rather than a benefit to the estate. "He wastes no time," Eleanor murmured, setting the letter down carefully. "You know Lord Harcourt, miss?" Mrs. Bramwell asked. "I know of him," Eleanor said, "and I begin to understand why his name keeps appearing where it should not." She looked up at the housekeeper, a new thought forming quickly in her mind. "Mrs. Bramwell, has anyone in this house ever heard of a company called Halden and Fenwick?" The housekeeper's face changed, only slightly, but enough for Eleanor to notice. "I believe, miss, that Mr. Finch mentioned that name once or twice, though never in front of the Duke. He always spoke of it quietly, in the sort of tone a man uses when he does not wish to be overheard." "Thank you, Mrs. Bramwell. That is very helpful. Eleanor closed her notebook and stood, her decision made. I believe it is time I saw the tenant farms with my own eyes, rather than only their names written across pages of unpaid claims. Would you have someone prepare a horse for me this afternoon, once the rain clears? By early afternoon, the clouds had thinned enough for Eleanor to set out along the muddy lane leading toward the eastern edge of the estate, the very fields Lord Harcourt seemed so eager to acquire. Daniel Foss rode alongside her, having offered, somewhat shyly, to show her the paths since he had grown up among these very farms as a boy. The Combe family lives just ahead, miss, Daniel said, guiding his horse around a deep puddle. Walter Combe has worked this land longer than almost anyone left on the estate. If anyone can tell you honestly what has gone wrong here, it will be him. They found Walter Combe repairing a fence with his own hands, his wife Alice working nearby in a small garden that looked carefully tended, despite clear signs of hardship all around it. Walter straightened when he saw the riders approaching, his expression wary, until Daniel called out a greeting and explained who accompanied him. "So you are the new steward," Walter said, wiping his hands on his trousers as Eleanor dismounted. His tone was not unfriendly, exactly, but carefully guarded, the tone of a man who had learned through hard experience not to trust easy promises. "Forgive me if I do not celebrate just yet, miss. We have heard grand words from Ashcombe Hall before." "I have not come with grand words, Mr. Combe," Eleanor said. "I have come with questions, and I would very much like honest answers, even if those answers reflect poorly on the estate." Something in her tone seemed to reach him, and slowly, the wariness in his face eased into something closer to cautious hope. He led her toward his small cottage, and along the way, Eleanor saw with her own eyes what the ledgers had only hinted at. A roof, patched with scraps of wood, rather than proper repair. A fence held together with rope where nails should have been. Fields that, though well tended, showed signs of soil exhausted from planting the same crop season after season without proper rest. Likely because the Combes could not afford to risk a season of lower yield. "We were promised new roofing 3 years past," Alice Combe said, joining them at the cottage door, her arms folded tightly against the cold. "Mr. Finch came himself, wrote it all down in his little book, told us the materials would arrive within the month. We are still waiting." "According to the estate's own records," Eleanor said carefully, "that repair was recorded as completed and paid for, 4 months after Mr. Finch's visit." Walter's jaw tightened. "Then the estate's records are a lie, miss, same as Finch's promises always were." Eleanor nodded slowly, writing the details into her notebook while the couple watched, some of their guardedness fading, as they realized she was not simply performing sympathy for appearances. Over the next 2 hours, she visited 4 more tenant farms along the eastern boundary, and at each one, she heard some version of the same story. Promises made, payments recorded, repairs never completed, rents raised slightly each year, always with some new explanation, while the condition of the land and cottages steadily worsened. By the time she turned her horse back toward Ashcombe Hall, the sun beginning to sink low and orange behind the hills, Eleanor's earlier anger had settled into something colder and more determined. This was no longer simply a matter of missing funds in a ledger. Real families had suffered years of quiet neglect, while someone, likely working alongside Lord Harcourt's interests, had drained the estate's wealth and let its people bear the cost. "You are quiet, miss," Daniel said, riding beside her as the hall came into view. "I am thinking," Eleanor said, "that fixing the numbers in a ledger will not be enough. I must fix what those numbers broke, or none of this will matter, however carefully I balance the books." That evening, she returned to the estate office and worked long past midnight, cross-referencing every tenant complaint against every ledger entry she could find, building a clear and damning record of exactly how much money had been claimed for repairs that were never made. The total, when she finally added it together, was staggering, more than enough on its own to explain a significant portion of the estate's crushing debt. She brought her findings to the Duke the following morning, laying the numbers before him plainly, along with what she had seen and heard at the tenant farms. He listened in silence, his face growing paler with every detail, though whether from illness or from grief at what his trusted steward had allowed to happen, Eleanor could not be certain. "I trusted him completely," the Duke said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 11 years, I trusted him. while my own people suffered under leaking roofs and broken fences, believing I had simply forgotten them. You did not forget them, Uncle, Eleanor said gently. You were deceived by a man skilled at deception. That is a different failing entirely, and one we can still correct. Can we? The Duke asked, and for the first time since her arrival, Eleanor heard something close to true despair in his voice. The debts owed to Halden and Fenwick alone could ruin us before harvest even arrives. Add to that everything owed the ordinary creditors, and I fear we are already past saving. Eleanor took a slow breath, steadying herself before she answered, because she understood that the next words she spoke needed to carry conviction, not only for her uncle's sake, but for her own resolve as well. We are not past saving, Uncle. We are simply past the point where careful bookkeeping alone will fix things. From here forward, I intend to repair what was broken, recover whatever can be recovered from those who took it wrongly, and rebuild the trust of every tenant on this land, one honest promise at a time. It will not be easy, and it will not be quick, but I do not believe it is impossible. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his tired eyes searching her face for any trace of false confidence, and finding none, something in his expression settled, as though a decision long uncertain had finally come to rest. Then do what you must, Eleanor, whatever it takes. I have placed my family's future in your hands, and I find, strangely, that I have never felt more certain of a decision in my life. Eleanor left his room that morning, carrying both the weight of his trust and the sharpened edge of her own anger, a combination that, she suspected, would serve her well in the difficult months ahead. Somewhere beyond the estate's borders, Lord Harcourt was waiting patiently for her failure, and somewhere within its very walls, Edgar Ashcombe, and perhaps others, were hoping quietly for the same outcome. But as she walked back toward the office where the truth of Ashcombe's ruin lay spread across dozens of open ledgers, Eleanor felt, for the first time since her arrival, not fear, but something closer to purpose. A fist pounded on the estate office door before the sun had fully risen, hard enough to rattle the old glass in its frame, and Eleanor was on her feet before she even realized she had moved. She opened it to find Walter Combs standing there, breathless, his coat soaked through from a hard ride in the early morning mist. Miss Whitmore, forgive the hour, he said quickly, but there is trouble at the Marsh cottage. A man came last night claiming Ashcombe owes rent arrears, going back 2 years, threatening to have the family removed from the land before the week is out. I told him he was mistaken, but he had papers with him, official-looking papers, and he would not listen to me. Eleanor's mind raced immediately back to the ledgers, to the pattern she had spent days untangling. Whose name was on the papers, Mr. Combe? He said he worked for a company, Halden and something. I did not catch the rest clearly. Her stomach turned cold. Halden and Fenwick again, moving quickly now, testing how far they could push while the estate's new steward was still finding her footing. Saddle my horse, she said. I am coming with you now. The ride to the Marsh cottage took nearly an hour, through lanes still slick with the previous day's rain, and Eleanor spent every minute of it turning over what she knew. If Halden and Fenwick were now moving directly against tenants, using false claims of unpaid rent to threaten families from their homes, then whoever controlled that company was growing bold, perhaps sensing an opportunity in the estate's sudden change of leadership. She arrived to find a well-dressed stranger standing in the muddy yard outside a small, weathered cottage, a leather folder tucked under his arm, speaking in low, firm tones to a frightened young couple standing in their doorway. The man turned as Eleanor's horse approached, his expression shifting quickly from confidence to careful assessment. Good morning, Eleanor said, dismounting without hurry, though her heart pounded harder than her calm voice suggested. I am Eleanor Whitmore, acting steward of Ashcombe Estate. I understand you have brought papers concerning this family's tenancy. Mr. Sedgwick, the man said, offering a shallow bow that felt more like mockery than courtesy. I represent Halden and Fenwick, Land and Finance. This tenancy carries arrears unpaid for 2 years, along with penalty interest, as specified in the original loan agreement between this company and the Ashcombe estate. I am authorized to begin proceedings to recover the debt through possession of the property, unless immediate payment can be arranged. May I see the agreement? Eleanor asked, holding out her hand with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. Mr. Sedgwick hesitated only a moment before producing a folded document from his leather folder. Eleanor read it carefully, twice, aware of Walter Kuhn watching anxiously from beside his horse, and the young tenant family clustered fearfully in their doorway. The agreement did indeed bear the Duke's signature at the bottom, though something about the ink and the slight unevenness of the handwriting struck her as familiar in an uncomfortable way. She had seen the Duke's true signature dozens of times now across older, legitimate ledgers, and this one, though close, did not sit quite right against her memory of it. "This signature," she said slowly. "When precisely was this agreement signed?" "2 years past," Sedgwick said. "The date is clearly marked." "The Duke has kept a careful diary of his engagements for the past decade," Eleanor said, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened, with the sense that she had found something important. "I intend to compare this date against his own record of where he was and what he signed on that particular day. If there is any discrepancy, Mr. Sedgwick, I will consider this document fraudulent, and I will bring the matter before every magistrate in the county." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Sedgwick's carefully composed face. "That is your prerogative, Miss Whitmore, but I assure you, the agreement is entirely legitimate." "Then you will not object to waiting a few days for me to confirm it," Eleanor said. "Before removing this family from their home, based on a single document, I have reasonable cause to doubt." Sedgwick's jaw tightened, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might press the matter further, but something in her calm certainty seemed to give him pause. "Very well. I shall return within the week. But understand, Miss Whitmore, the debt is real. Whatever you believe about this particular signature, Halden and Fenwick will have what is owed, one way or another." He mounted his waiting horse and rode off down the muddy lane, leaving Eleanor standing with the young tenant family, both of them staring at her with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Thank you, miss," the young husband said quietly. "We did not know what we would do if he had insisted further." "You are safe for now," Eleanor said, though privately she knew the true battle had only just begun. "I promise you, I will get to the bottom of this before that man returns." That afternoon, back at Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor pulled every ledger from the years surrounding the supposed agreement and laid them across the office desk alongside the Duke's private diary, which Mrs. Bramwell retrieved for her with quiet efficiency. Line by line she compared dates, and within 2 hours she found what she had suspected. On the very day the fraudulent agreement claimed to have been signed, the Duke's diary recorded him traveling to London for a full week, nowhere near Ashcombe Hall at all. She brought the discovery immediately to the Duke, spreading both documents before him on his bed. He examined them with the careful, practiced eye of a man who had signed thousands of papers in his lifetime, and slowly, his expression darkened into something colder than Eleanor had yet seen from him. "This is not my signature," he said finally. "It is close enough to fool a careless eye, but it is not mine. I would stake my life on it." "Then someone forged your signature to bind this estate to a debt that never truly existed," Eleanor said, "and used that false debt to threaten a family from their home, likely as the first step toward claiming the land beneath their cottage." The Duke's hands tightened into fists atop his blanket, frustration and fury mixing visibly with his weakness. "Finch," he said bitterly. "It must have been Finch, working with this Halden and Fenwick company all along, perhaps even working for Harcourt directly." "That is what I intend to prove," Eleanor said, "but we must move carefully. If Sedgwick returns and finds us unprepared, he may attempt to force the matter through the courts before we can properly expose the fraud." Over the following days, Eleanor threw herself into building a case, as solid as stone. She gathered every ledger entry connected to Halden and Fenwick, every diary entry proving the Duke's true whereabouts on dates in question, and statements from tenants describing repairs promised and never delivered. She wrote to a solicitor in the county town, a man unconnected to Mr. Pemberton's long-standing loyalties, asking for an independent opinion on the forged agreement. Mr. Pemberton himself, upon learning of the forgery, arrived at the office one afternoon, with an expression far less hostile than their first meeting had shown. "I confess, Miss Whitmore, I did not expect to find myself agreeing with your methods so quickly. If this signature is indeed forged, it changes everything. It may mean Finch's crimes ran far deeper and far more dangerously than simple theft. It may also mean," Eleanor said carefully, "that whoever benefits from Ashcombe's ruin has been planning this for longer than any of us realized, and that Mr. Finch's disappearance was not merely an escape, but a piece of a much larger design." Pemberton studied her for a long moment, his earlier suspicion now mixed with something closer to grudging respect. "I will help you build this case properly, Miss Whitmore, in whatever way my knowledge of the law allows. If someone has committed fraud against this family, I intend to see them answer for it, whatever else I think of the manner of your appointment." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. The first true alliance she had built since arriving at Ashcombe. "Then let us begin, Mr. Pemberton. We have very little time before Mr. Sedgwick returns expecting a family removed from their home, and I intend to greet him instead, with proof that his entire claim is built upon a lie." Outside the office window, the fields of Ashcombe stretched wide and green under a clearing sky, waiting for the harvest that would decide everything, while somewhere beyond the estate's borders, the people who had engineered its downfall were about to discover that the woman they believed they could easily outmaneuver had no intention of backing down. A letter arrived from the county court on a gray morning, and Eleanor's hands went cold the moment she broke the seal. Halden and Fenwick had not waited quietly for her investigation to finish. Instead, they had filed a formal notice demanding immediate payment of the entire disputed loan, along with several smaller debts scattered across the estate's other accounts, all called due at once, far earlier than any reasonable schedule allowed. She read the notice twice, her mind working quickly through the implications. Calling in several debts simultaneously, before Ashcombe had any chance to gather funds from the coming harvest, was not the action of a patient creditor seeking rightful payment. It was a deliberate attempt to force failure, timed precisely to catch the estate at its most vulnerable moment, while its new steward was still fighting simply to understand the full scope of the damage. She brought the notice to Mr. Pemberton that same afternoon, finding him in the small study he had claimed as his own within Ashcombe Hall, surrounded by his own careful stacks of legal papers. He read it in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. "This is not standard practice," he said finally. "Even a legitimate creditor rarely calls in multiple debts at once without warning, unless there is a specific clause allowing it, or unless the creditor wishes to force a particular outcome rather than simply recover their money. Lord Harcourt wants the eastern fields," Eleanor said. "If Ashcombe cannot pay, and the estate is forced to sell land quickly to settle these debts, I suspect we will find Harcourt's name attached to the very first offer to purchase them." Pemberton set the notice down slowly. "You believe Harcourt controls Halden and Fenwick directly?" "I believe he controls it closely enough that the difference hardly matters," Eleanor said. "Whether his name appears on the company's papers or not. The timing of this notice, arriving so soon after we began questioning the forged agreement, cannot be coincidence." Over the following days, Eleanor worked with a focus that left little room for rest. She wrote formal responses to the court disputing the legitimacy of the forged agreement, supported by the Duke's diary and the independent solicitor's growing confirmation that the signature did not match verified examples of the Duke's hand. She requested, and eventually received, a short delay in the court's proceedings while the forgery claim was properly examined, buying precious time that Ashcombe desperately needed. But even with the immediate crisis temporarily held at bay, the underlying debts remained, real and pressing, threatening to crush the estate, regardless of how the forgery case resolved. Eleanor spent long evenings with the ledgers, calculating exactly how much money would be needed to satisfy the legitimate creditors before harvest, and the sum that stared back at her from the page felt, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely impossible. She brought her calculations to the Duke one evening, laying them plainly before him without softening the difficulty of what they faced. "Even setting aside the fraudulent debt entirely," she said, "the legitimate obligations still exceed what the estate currently holds by a significant margin. We need funds now, Uncle, funds that harvest alone will not provide quickly enough." The Duke studied the numbers with a tired but attentive eye. "What do you propose?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before answering, knowing the suggestion would not be welcomed easily. "There are assets within this house that serve no true purpose beyond tradition and pride. Silver that sits locked away and unused. An old carriage that has not left its shed in years. Orchard rights on the northern boundary that we lease out already, but could sell outright for a considerable sum. None of it is essential to running this estate, Uncle, but together it could raise enough to satisfy our most urgent creditors while we work to resolve the rest." The Duke was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the struggle playing across his tired face, the pull between practical necessity and a lifetime spent believing certain family possessions should never be parted with, regardless of circumstance. My father gave that silver to my mother, he said quietly. And that carriage belonged to my grandfather. I understand the weight of what I am asking, Eleanor said gently. But silver cannot feed a tenant family, and an unused carriage cannot pay a debt that threatens to take their homes. I believe your father and your grandfather would rather see their gifts sold to save this estate than kept locked away while it crumbles around them. The Duke closed his eyes, and for a long moment, Eleanor feared she had pushed too hard, too soon. Then, slowly, he nodded. Do what you must, Eleanor. I trusted you with everything else. I will trust you with this as well. The decision, once made, spread quickly through the household, and not everyone received it with the Duke's quiet resignation. Edgar Ashcombe arrived at the estate 2 days later, summoned by a letter from Mr. Pemberton, informing him of the family's dire financial situation, and his reaction upon learning of Eleanor's plan was immediate and sharp. You intend to sell my grandfather's carriage, he said, finding Eleanor in the estate office, his voice tight with barely restrained outrage. And my grandmother's silver, given to her on her wedding day. This is not stewardship, Miss Whitmore. This is a stranger, dismantling my family's legacy, piece by piece. Your family's legacy, Eleanor said calmly, refusing to be drawn into matching his anger, will not survive at all if this estate collapses under debt within the year. I understand these objects carry meaning for you, Mr. Ashcombe, but meaning does not pay creditors, and pride does not keep tenant families in their homes. And who are you to decide what my family values? Edgar demanded. You arrived here days ago. You know nothing of what this estate has meant to generations of Ashcombes before you. I know that generations of Ashcombes built something worth protecting, Eleanor replied evenly. And I know that a corrupt steward and a scheming neighbor very nearly destroyed it, while everyone was too busy protecting silver and carriages to notice the true danger. I am trying to save what actually matters, Mr. Ashcombe. If that means selling objects that serve no purpose beyond sitting in a locked room, I will do it without hesitation, and I would ask that you consider whether your objection is truly about the estate's survival or something else entirely. Edgar's face flushed with anger, but he found no immediate answer to counter her words, and after a long, tense silence, he turned and left the office without another word, his footsteps sharp and hurried down the corridor. Eleanor exhaled slowly once he had gone, aware that she had made an enemy of him more openly now than perhaps she needed to, yet unwilling to regret speaking the truth plainly. Within the week, the silver, the carriage, and the orchard rights had all been sold, through careful, discreet arrangements that Mr. Pemberton helped negotiate, drawing on contacts built over 20 years of practice. The funds raised were not enough to erase Ashcombe's debts entirely, but they were enough to satisfy the most urgent creditors and buy the estate crucial breathing room, while the harvest ripened in the fields. Eleanor stood in the estate office late one evening, reviewing the newly balanced ledger with something close to relief, the first genuine progress she had managed to achieve since her arrival. But even as she allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction, a fold of paper on the corner of her desk caught her eye, a note that had not been there that morning. She unfolded it carefully and read the few lines within, written in a hand she did not recognize. The message was brief, unsigned, and deeply unsettling. It warned her, in careful and deliberately vague language, that selling family treasures would not save Ashcombe, and that certain people had far more patience and far more resources than she seemed to understand. Eleanor set the note down slowly, her earlier relief replaced by a cold, creeping wariness. Someone within Ashcombe Hall, or someone with easy access to it, was watching her every move closely enough to know exactly where to leave such a message, and clearly wished her to understand that selling assets and disputing forged signatures had done little to discourage whoever truly stood behind Ashcombe's ruin. If anything, it seemed her small victories had only made them more determined to see her fail. Eleanor did not sleep after finding the note. She sat by candlelight, turning it over in her hands, studying the careful, deliberately plain handwriting for any clue as to its author. But whoever had written it had taken care to leave nothing recognizable behind. By morning, she had decided against sharing it with the Duke, whose health remained fragile enough that she feared the added worry might do him real harm. Instead, she folded the note into the back of her notebook and resolved to be more careful about who could access the estate office and when. The funds raised from the sale of the silver and carriage had bought Ashcombe time, but time alone would not settle everything that remained owed. Eleanor spent the following days deep in negotiation with the estate's other creditors, a task that required a different kind of skill entirely, from reading ledgers or riding out to tenant farms. She learned quickly that most creditors, however firm their letters appeared on paper, preferred a steady partial payment and a clear plan for the rest, over the uncertainty of forcing an estate into complete collapse, where they might recover nothing at all. She traveled into the county town herself to meet with the largest of these creditors, a merchant banker named Mr. Aldous Gray, whose reputation for firmness was well known throughout the region. She arrived at his offices prepared with a full account of Ashcombe's finances, honest about the extent of the difficulty, and equally honest about the concrete steps already taken to address it. "Most stewards who come to me in your position," Mr. Gray said, studying her across his wide desk, "arrive either full of empty promises or already defeated before they walk through my door. You are neither, Miss Whitmore. That is unusual enough that I find myself inclined to listen carefully to what you propose." "I propose honesty, Mr. Gray," Eleanor said. "Ashcombe cannot pay everything owed within the month. I will not pretend otherwise. But the harvest is strong this year, stronger than it has been in several seasons, and I intend to have every debt settled in full before the season ends, provided our creditors show reasonable patience in the meantime." Gray studied her papers carefully, comparing her figures against his own records, and after a long, considering silence, he nodded slowly. "I will agree to extend your timeline, Miss Whitmore, provided you send me monthly accounts of the estate's progress, and provided the first partial payment arrives within the fortnight, as you have proposed." It was, Eleanor knew, a significant victory, though one through nothing more dramatic than careful honesty and clear numbers laid plainly on a desk. She left Gray's office with a signed agreement in hand, and a growing sense that Ashcombe's survival, while still far from certain, was no longer quite so far beyond reach as it had seemed only weeks before. Back at the estate, however, other troubles continued to simmer beneath the surface. Word of the sold family treasures had spread quickly through the household and beyond, and not everyone in the surrounding county viewed Eleanor's decisions kindly. At a small gathering hosted by a neighboring family, one she attended reluctantly at the Duke's insistence, in order to maintain appearances of stability, she found herself the subject of pointed whispers and thinly veiled criticism from guests who clearly believed a woman had no place managing an estate of Ashcombe's size. "I hear the Ashcombe silver has been sold off entirely," one older woman remarked to another, just loud enough for Eleanor to overhear as she passed. "One wonders what family heirloom will disappear next, now that a farmer's daughter holds the household accounts." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to let the comment show any effect, though it stung more than she cared to admit. She had grown used to doubt from Mr. Pemberton and hostility from Edgar, but the casual cruelty of strangers who knew nothing of the true circumstances still managed to catch her off guard. It was Alice Combe, of all people, who offered unexpected comfort that same week, arriving at the estate office with a basket of fresh bread and a directness that cut through Eleanor's quiet frustration. "You mustn't mind what fine ladies at parties say, miss," Alice said, setting the basket down. "Half of them have never balanced a single ledger in their lives, and the other half would sooner see Ashcombe fail than admit a woman managed to save it where their own husband's stewards could not." "It is not their opinion of me that troubles me, Mrs. Combe," Eleanor admitted. "It is the fear that they may be right, that I am simply not equal to what this estate requires." Alice studied her for a long moment, her expression softening. "Do you know what my Walter said, the very night you rode out to see our home with your own eyes? He said he had never once, in all his years on this land, seen a steward from Ashcombe Hall look him in the eye and ask an honest question, let alone listen to the honest answer. Whatever those fine ladies whisper at their parties, miss, that is worth more to the people actually living on this land than every piece of silver you have sold." The words stayed with Eleanor long after Alice had gone, a small but steady anchor against the doubts that crept in during her quieter, more exhausted hours. She returned to the ledgers with renewed determination, and over the following weeks, slowly built a working system that had never truly existed under Gerald Finch's management. Regular visits to every tenant farm, honest records of repairs promised and repairs completed, clear accounts shared openly with the Duke rather than hidden away in locked drawers. Progress remained slow and difficult, punctuated by setbacks that tested her patience at every turn. A shipment of grain seed arrived damaged from poor storage, forcing an unexpected expense to replace it before planting could properly continue in the fields still awaiting late crops. A dispute arose between two tenant families over shared water rights to a stream running along their boundary, requiring Eleanor to spend an entire exhausting day mediating a fair solution that left both families reasonably satisfied. Each small crisis pulled her attention in a different direction, yet she found, gradually, that she was growing more confident in handling them, more trusted by those around her, and more familiar with the true rhythms of managing land far larger than her own small farm had ever demanded. Even Mr. Pemberton's attitude continued to soften with each passing week, his early hostility replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect for the thoroughness of her methods. "I confess, Miss Whitmore," he admitted one evening, as they reviewed the latest creditor payments together, "I expected either recklessness or timidity from someone so young and so unused to an estate of this scale. I find instead a discipline I rarely encounter, even among solicitors twice your age." "I take that as high praise, Mr. Pemberton," Eleanor said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "It is meant as such," he replied. "Though I remain concerned about Halden and Fenwick, and about Lord Harcourt's continued interest in this estate. Buying time with our other creditors accomplishes little if the forged debt and the timed pressure behind it are not resolved decisively." Eleanor's smile faded slightly, her mind returning to the unsigned warning still folded into the back of her notebook. "I have not forgotten them, Mr. Pemberton. I am simply waiting for the right moment, and the right proof, to confront them properly. When that moment comes, I intend to be entirely ready." Outside, the fields of Ashcombe continued to ripen under the summer sun, weeks now from the harvest that would decide so much, while somewhere beyond the estate's boundaries, patient enemies continued watching, waiting for a single misstep that would finally hand them everything they had spent years quietly working to take. The sky over Ashcombe turned a deep, threatening green just after midday, and Eleanor felt the change before she saw it. A strange stillness in the air that every farmer's daughter learns to recognize as danger. She was standing in the western field, inspecting the nearly ripe wheat with Walter Combe, when the wind suddenly shifted, cold and sharp, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of a storm building fast. "That is no ordinary rain coming, miss," Walter said, his weathered face turning grim as he studied the horizon. "I have seen skies like that only twice before in my life. Both times, we lost fields we could not afford to lose." Eleanor's stomach dropped. The wheat in the western and southern fields represented the largest portion of the estate's expected harvest, the very foundation of the plan she had built to satisfy the remaining debts before the season's end. If the crop was destroyed now, weeks before it could be properly gathered, all the careful progress of the past months would collapse in a single afternoon. "We need every hand we can gather," she said, already turning her horse toward the hall. "Send word to every tenant family within reach. Whatever can be harvested early, however imperfect, must be brought in before that storm arrives." Word spread through Ashcombe faster than Eleanor would have thought possible, carried by riders sent in every direction, and within the hour, tenants who had spent months cautiously watching her leadership from a careful distance began arriving in the western fields with scythes, carts, and whatever tools they could carry. Daniel Foss organized the estate's own laborers with a quiet efficiency that surprised even Eleanor, directing carts toward the areas where crops stood closest to ready, while Alice Combe and several other women began organizing makeshift shelter for whatever grain could be gathered before the rain made storage impossible. Eleanor worked alongside them from the very first hour, her fine steward's coat abandoned early and forgotten somewhere near the field's edge, her hands soon as muddy and calloused as any tenant farmer's. She had grown up doing this very work on her own small farm, and the familiar motion of cutting and gathering steadied her nerves even as the sky darkened further overhead and distant thunder began rolling across the hills. "You needn't do this yourself, miss," one of the older laborers said, watching her work beside him with evident surprise. "Surely the steward's place is to direct, not to labor in the mud alongside us." "The steward's place," Eleanor said, not pausing in her work, "is wherever the estate needs her most. Today, that place is here." Word of her efforts spread through the working fields as quickly as the storm clouds themselves, and Eleanor noticed, even amid the exhausting labor, A subtle shift in how the tenants and laborers around her began to work, faster, more willingly, as though her presence among them in the mud had settled some final, lingering doubt about whether she truly cared for Ashcomb's people, or merely for its numbers. The storm broke just as the last cart of the Western Fields wheat was hauled beneath temporary cover, rain falling in heavy, relentless sheets that turned the freshly cut fields into churned mud within minutes. Eleanor stood beneath the shelter of a wide barn roof, soaked through and utterly exhausted, watching the storm rage across the land they had raced so desperately to save. "We lost the southern field entirely," Walter said grimly, coming to stand beside her, water dripping steadily from his hat. "There was simply no time to reach it before the rain came. But we saved the western field," Eleanor said, "and a good portion of what stood in the northern acres as well. It is not everything, Mr. Combe, but it is far more than we would have kept had we waited even another hour." Walter nodded slowly, studying her, with an expression that had changed considerably since their first wary meeting weeks before. "I will admit, miss, I did not expect to see the Ashcombe steward standing knee-deep in mud alongside the rest of us today. My father used to say, a leader's true measure is shown not in comfortable times, but in the moment the sky turns dark and the crop is at risk. I believe he would have approved of what he saw today." The storm lasted through the night, and by morning, the full extent of the damage became clear across the estate. The southern fields crop was largely ruined, a painful loss that would reduce the harvest's expected yield significantly. Yet the western and northern fields, saved through the desperate efforts of tenants and laborers working alongside their steward, would still provide enough grain to meet a substantial portion of what Ashcombe needed before the debts came fully due. Eleanor spent the following days assessing the damage carefully, adjusting her calculations to account for the lost southern crop, and searching for ways to offset the shortfall elsewhere. She found unexpected help in the northern orchards, where an early and unusually strong fruit yield offered a source of income she had not originally accounted for in her plans, enough, when carefully managed, to help cover much of what the storm had cost them. More valuable than any single field, however, was the change she noticed rippling through the household and the tenant farms alike in the storm's aftermath. Servants who had once regarded her with polite but distant suspicion now greeted her with genuine warmth. Tenants who had guarded their words carefully during her earlier visits now spoke to her openly, trusting her with concerns and suggestions they would never have shared with Gerald Finch. Even Mrs. Bramwell, whose careful neutrality had marked every interaction since Eleanor's arrival, began sharing small observations about the household's daily workings that proved quietly useful in ways Eleanor had not expected. "You have earned something this past week that Finch never managed in 11 years, Mrs. Bramwell told her one evening, as they reviewed the household's provisions together following the storm's disruption. "The staff no longer merely obey you, miss. They have begun to trust you. That is a rarer thing than obedience, and considerably more valuable." Eleanor carried those words with her when she visited the Duke that night, finding him sitting up in bed for the first time in weeks. Color returned faintly to his tired face, listening intently as she described the storm, the losses, and the unexpected strength shown by the estate's people in the crisis's aftermath. "You worked in the mud alongside them," the Duke said, something like quiet pride warming his voice. "I confess, Eleanor, I did not expect that of you, though perhaps I should have. Your father was much the same, from what little I remember of him. A man who believed leadership meant standing beside his people, not merely above them." "I learned it from him," Eleanor admitted, "though I suspect Ashcomb's people would have trusted anyone willing to stand in that mud with them, regardless of what they learned from their fathers." The Duke smiled faintly, and for the first time since her arrival, Eleanor allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that Ashcombe might truly survive this crisis after all. The southern fields' loss stung, and the debts owed to Halden and Fenwick still loomed unresolved, but the estate's people, from the humblest laborer to the most skeptical solicitor, had begun to stand firmly behind her, and that, she was beginning to understand, might prove more valuable, in the difficult months ahead, than any single field of wheat. Edgar Ashcombe returned to the estate uninvited on a warm afternoon, 3 relatives trailing behind him, all wearing the particular expression of people who believed they were about to correct a serious mistake. Eleanor was reviewing the storm's damage report in the estate office when Mr. Price announced their arrival, with a carefully composed face. that nonetheless betrayed a flicker of concern. "They wish to speak with the Duke directly, miss," Price said quietly. "Mr. Edgar has been quite insistent." Eleanor set down her pen, understanding immediately what this visit likely meant. She had heard whispers over recent days that Edgar had been writing to distant relatives, sharing carefully selected details about the sold silver, the storm's damage to the southern field, and the still unresolved debt to Halden and Fenwick, framing each piece of news in the worst possible light. This gathering, arriving together and unannounced, had clearly been planned. She followed Price to the Duke's bedroom, arriving just as Edgar and his companions were being shown inside. The Duke, propped up against his pillows, regarded his nephew with a tired but wary expression, clearly sensing the purpose behind this sudden family visit before a word had been spoken. "Uncle," Edgar began, his tone carefully respectful on the surface, though Eleanor recognized the sharp edge beneath it immediately. "We have come because we love this family and this estate, and we can no longer stand by silently while it is dismantled piece by piece under the management of someone entirely unsuited to the task." "I trust you refer to Miss Whitmore," the Duke said dryly, "and not to yourself, Edgar, though I confess, I have wondered lately at your sudden and considerable interest in Ashcomb's private affairs." Edgar's jaw tightened slightly, but he pressed forward. "The family silver is gone. Grandfather's carriage is gone. A significant portion of the southern harvest was lost entirely in the recent storm, and Halden and Fenwick still pursue a substantial debt through the courts. Whatever her intentions, Uncle, the numbers speak plainly. Ashcombe is not being saved, it is being taken apart." One of the accompanying relatives, an older cousin Eleanor had never formally met, added her own voice with practiced concern. "We only wish to see the estate properly managed, Edmund. Surely a temporary arrangement made in a moment of illness need not become permanent, particularly when the results speak so clearly for themselves." Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to an attack delivered so carefully in front of the one person whose opinion mattered most. She kept her voice level, refusing to match the barely concealed hostility directed her way. "I understand your concerns," she said, "and I will not pretend the past months have been without setbacks. The storm cost us dearly, and the debt owed to Halden and Fenwick remains unresolved. But I would ask, before this family draws its conclusions, that you allow me to show you the complete picture, rather than only the pieces most convenient to your argument." She turned to the Duke. "Uncle, might I bring the full ledger, and the harvest projections, so your family may judge the situation honestly, rather than through selective rumor?" The Duke nodded, and within a quarter hour, Eleanor returned with a careful accounting of everything accomplished since her arrival, laid plainly for the assembled family to examine. The silver and carriage sold, yes, but the funds raised had satisfied the estate's most urgent creditors, avoiding immediate collapse. The southern field lost to the storm, yes, but the western and northern fields saved through swift action, along with an unexpected orchard yield that would help offset much of the shortfall. Regular payments already made to Mr. Gray and several other significant creditors, with formal agreements in place extending the timeline for the rest, provided the harvest arrived as expected. "And the Halden and Fenwick debt?" Edgar pressed, clearly searching for the weakest point in her defense. "The largest debt threatening this estate, still entirely unresolved after months of your management." "That debt," Eleanor said, "is built upon a forged signature, Mr. Ashcombe. A fact I have been carefully building proof of for weeks, with the assistance of an independent solicitor and Mr. Pemberton himself. I did not wish to move against it publicly until the evidence was strong enough to withstand any challenge. But since you press the matter so directly, I am prepared to say plainly that I believe your uncle's own signature was forged to bind this estate to a debt it never legitimately owed, likely by Mr. Finch, working in cooperation with Lord Harcourt's interests." The room fell silent. Even Edgar, who had clearly arrived prepared with a series of pointed accusations, seemed momentarily thrown by the directness of her claim. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "It is," Eleanor agreed, "which is precisely why I have taken such care in proving it, rather than making the claim carelessly. I did not expect to share this before I was fully ready, but since this gathering seems determined to judge my stewardship this very afternoon, I would rather you judge it with the full truth before you, rather than only the parts most useful, to whatever conclusion certain among you may already hope to reach." The pointed final phrase was not lost on Edgar, whose face flushed slightly, though he offered no direct response. The older cousin who had spoken earlier glanced between Edgar and Eleanor with new uncertainty, clearly reconsidering the confidence with which she had arrived. The Duke, who had watched the entire exchange in silence, finally spoke, his voice weak, but carrying enough authority to still every other voice in the room. "I have heard enough. Eleanor's stewardship remains as I appointed it, and I will hear no further argument on the matter today. If any of you doubt her judgment, I invite you to spend a single week managing this estate's true difficulties yourselves, before you criticize how she has managed them." Edgar's companions shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that the visit had not achieved its intended purpose. Edgar himself remained a moment longer, studying Eleanor with an expression she could not entirely read, somewhere between frustration and something more calculating. "This is not finished, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, before turning to leave the room, his relatives trailing uncertainly behind him. Once the family had gone, the Duke exhaled slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Forgive them, Eleanor. Edgar has always believed the estate should have passed more directly through his branch of the family, and my decision to appoint you has clearly wounded whatever ambitions he harbored." "There is no need to apologize, Uncle," Eleanor said gently. "I expected resistance from the very beginning. I only hope today's visit has settled the matter clearly enough that it need not be repeated." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his tired eyes. "I do not believe Edgar will give up so easily, whatever was said here today. Be careful, Eleanor. A man who believes he has been wrongly denied something rarely accepts defeat gracefully, particularly when he suspects the ground beneath his rival may not be quite as solid as it appears." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the warning for exactly what it was, and as she made her way back toward the estate office that evening, she could not entirely shake the uneasy feeling that Edgar's visit, however unsuccessful, marked not the end of a threat, but merely the beginning of a more careful and more dangerous one still to come. The independent solicitor's letter arrived on a bright morning 3 weeks after Edgar's failed visit, and Eleanor tore it open the moment Mr. Price placed it in her hands, her heart pounding with anticipation she had carried for weeks. She read the contents twice, to be certain she had understood correctly, then hurried immediately to find Mr. Pemberton, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. "It is confirmed," she said, finding him in his study, surrounded by his usual careful stacks of papers. The solicitor compared the signature on the Halden and Fenwick agreement against 6 verified examples of the Duke's true signature, spanning 10 years of documents. He states plainly that the forgery, while skillfully done, shows clear and consistent differences that no honest expert could dismiss as mere natural variation. Pemberton took the letter and read it carefully, his expression growing steadily more satisfied as he reached the solicitor's final, unambiguous conclusion. "This is exactly what we needed, Miss Whitmore." Combined with the Duke's diary proving his location on the supposed date of signing, and the tenant complaints demonstrating the pattern of unpaid repairs recorded as completed, we now have more than sufficient grounds to challenge the entire debt before the court, and to expose whoever orchestrated this fraud from the very beginning. "Then it is time," Eleanor said, "to confront them directly, rather than simply defending against their claims from a distance." Together, they spent the following days, preparing carefully for what Eleanor knew would be the most important confrontation since her arrival at Ashcombe. She learned that the estate's major creditors, along with several prominent landowners of the county, including Lord Harcourt himself, were scheduled to attend a formal gathering hosted by the county's chief magistrate the following week, an event meant to discuss several ongoing financial disputes across the region. It was, Eleanor realized immediately, the perfect setting to expose the fraud publicly, before an audience whose good opinion Lord Harcourt could not afford to lose. She arrived at the gathering with Mr. Pemberton beside her, carrying a carefully organized folder of evidence, her nerves steadied by the same calm determination that had carried her through every difficult moment since her arrival at Ashcombe. Mr. Sedgwick was present, representing Halden and Fenwick as expected, and Lord Harcourt himself stood nearby, engaged in easy, confident conversation with several other landowners, entirely unaware of what was about to unfold. The magistrate, a stern but fair man named Sir Alistair Whitfield, opened the floor for any parties wishing to raise matters of dispute before the assembled gathering, and Eleanor stepped forward before her courage could waver. "Sir Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I wish to raise a serious matter concerning a fraudulent debt claimed against Ashcombe Estate by the firm Halden and Fenwick, a debt built upon a forged signature attributed to the Duke of Ashcombe." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, and Eleanor noticed Lord Harcourt's easy smile falter slightly, though he quickly composed himself. Mr. Sedgwick stepped forward, his voice sharp with practiced indignation. "This is a baseless accusation, Sir Whitfield. Miss Whitmore has raised this claim before, without proper proof." "I have proof now," Eleanor said calmly, opening her folder and presenting the documents one by one before the magistrate. "An independent solicitor's confirmation that the signature on this agreement does not match 6 verified examples of the Duke's true signature across 10 years of documents. The Duke's own diary, proving he was in London on the very date the agreement claims he signed it at Ashcombe Hall, and sworn statements from multiple tenant families describing repairs recorded as paid and completed, yet never actually carried out, funds which appear to have been diverted through this very same company." Sir Whitfield examined each document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave as he moved through the evidence. "This is a considerable body of proof, Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "Miss Sedgwick, does Halden and Fenwick have any response to these specific claims?" Sedgwick's confidence had visibly cracked, his earlier sharpness replaced by careful hesitation. "I represent the company's interests, Sir Whitfield. I was not personally involved in the original arrangement of this loan." "Then who was?" Eleanor asked directly, turning her gaze toward Lord Harcourt, whose easy smile had disappeared entirely. Perhaps Lord Harcourt might clarify his own connection to Halden and Fenwick, given that several of the company's most damaging loans against Ashcombe seem, upon careful examination, to align remarkably well with his long-standing interest in the estate's eastern fields. Every eye in the room turned toward Lord Harcourt, and for a long, tense moment, he said nothing, his composed expression cracking just enough to reveal the calculation happening rapidly behind it. "I hold certain financial interests connected to several companies across this county, Miss Whitmore, as does nearly every landowner present today. That is hardly evidence of wrongdoing." "Perhaps not on its own," Eleanor said, "but combined with a forged signature, years of diverted repair funds, and a debt called in suddenly and aggressively, at precisely the moment this estate changed leadership, I believe any reasonable person here today would find the pattern deeply troubling." Sir Whitfield studied Lord Harcourt for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning back to address the gathering formally. "Given the evidence presented today, I am ordering an immediate and thorough investigation into the practices of Halden and Fenwick, and into any individuals connected to its dealings with Ashcombe Estate. Until that investigation concludes, the disputed debt shall be considered void, and any further attempt to enforce it against Ashcombe's tenants or property will be treated as a serious offense before this court." A wave of murmurs spread through the assembled crowd, and Eleanor felt, for the first time in months, the full weight of relief settling over her, though she kept her expression carefully composed, aware that the moment demanded dignity rather than open celebration. Lord Harcourt, his face tight with barely controlled fury, offered no further argument, understanding clearly that any further denial in front of so many witnesses would only deepen the suspicion now firmly attached to his name. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Lord Harcourt approached her briefly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly. "You have made a formidable enemy today, Miss Whitmore, whatever the investigation eventually concludes." "I have made an honest enemy of a dishonest man, my lord," Eleanor replied evenly. "I find I can live with that far more easily than I could have lived with silence." He said nothing further, turning and walking away, with what dignity he could still manage, and Eleanor allowed herself, finally, a small, genuine breath of relief. Mr. Pemberton stepped up beside her, his expression carrying something close to open admiration for the first time since their earliest hostile meeting. "That," he said quietly, "was very well done, Miss Whitmore. I do not believe Halden and Fenwick, or Lord Harcourt, will trouble Ashcombe again quite so boldly." "The investigation will take time," Eleanor said, "and I do not doubt Harcourt will fight to protect himself in whatever ways remain available to him. But for today, at least, I believe we have taken back what was stolen, and shown every doubter in that room that Ashcombe will not be so easily taken apart." They rode back toward the estate together as the afternoon sun began to soften into evening, and for the first time since her arrival, Eleanor felt the true weight begin to lift from her shoulders, though she knew, even as relief washed through her, that the harvest itself, and the final settling of every remaining debt, still waited just ahead, the true test of everything she had fought so hard to build. The morning of the harvest broke clear and golden, the kind of light that seemed to promise good fortune after months of storms and struggle, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the western field long before the rest of the estate had risen, watching the wheat sway gently in the early breeze. It had survived, whole and ready, and beyond it, the northern fields and the unexpectedly generous orchard waited as well, each one representing weeks of careful labor and hard-won trust. Word had spread throughout the county in the days following the confrontation at Sir Whitfield's gathering, and the investigation into Halden and Fenwick had moved swiftly once begun, uncovering exactly the pattern of fraud Eleanor had long suspected. Gerald Finch, it emerged through testimony gathered from several minor employees of the company, had indeed forged the Duke's signature with Lord Harcourt's knowledge and encouragement, diverting repair funds and estate income into accounts controlled jointly between them, all while carefully engineering the debt structure that had nearly brought Ashcombe to ruin. Lord Harcourt's reputation across the county had suffered considerably as the details became public, and several of his own creditors, made newly cautious by the scandal, had begun pressing him with a scrutiny he had clearly never expected to face himself. By the time the harvest began in earnest, the disputed debt had been formally and permanently voided, and Ashcombe's true financial position, while still requiring careful management, no longer teetered on the edge of collapse. Eleanor worked alongside the tenants once again through the harvest, as she had during the storm months before, and this time there was no hesitation among the laborers, no wariness in how they welcomed her presence among them. She had earned, through months of honest effort, a place among Ashcombe's people that no title alone could have granted her. Walter Combe found her late one afternoon, resting briefly in the shade at the edge of the western field, and sat down beside her with the easy familiarity of a man who had long since set aside his earlier doubts. "The yield this year is stronger than any I can remember, miss," he said, "even accounting for what the storm took from us in the south." "It is stronger," Eleanor agreed, "because the people working this land finally believe their efforts will be honestly rewarded, rather than quietly stolen by someone hiding behind a locked office door." Walter smiled, a rare and genuine expression that Eleanor had come to value greatly over the months of their acquaintance. "My father always said the health of an estate could be read plainly in the faces of the people working its fields, long before it ever showed itself in any ledger." "If that is true, miss, I would say Ashcombe has never looked healthier in all my years here." By the time the final wagons of grain rolled into the estate's storehouses, Eleanor had spent long nights calculating every remaining debt against the harvest's full yield, and the numbers, for the first time since her arrival, told a story of genuine and complete recovery. Every legitimate creditor, including Mr. Gray and the several others whose patience she had carefully earned over the difficult months, could now be paid in full, with a modest surplus remaining to begin proper repairs on the tenant cottages that had been neglected for years under Gerald Finch's corrupt management. She brought the completed ledger to the Duke on a cool evening, as autumn's first chill began settling over the estate, finding him sitting in a chair by his window rather than confined to his bed, his health steadily improving now that the worst of his worries had finally been resolved. He read through the final accounting slowly and carefully, his eyes lingering on each entry, and when he finally looked up at her, Eleanor saw something in his expression she had not seen since her very first evening at Ashcombe, a deep and unguarded pride that needed no words to make itself understood. "Every debt," he said quietly, "settled before the season's end, exactly as you promised me the night I asked you to come here." "Every debt," Eleanor confirmed. "The tenant cottages will see proper repairs beginning next spring, funded honestly this time, and recorded honestly as well. The estate stands on solid ground for the first time in many years, Uncle, and I believe, with careful management, it will only grow stronger from here." The Duke set the ledger aside and studied her for a long, quiet moment, the autumn light softening the lines of his tired but healthier face. "When I sent for you, Eleanor, I did so out of desperation, uncertain whether I was making the wisest decision of my life or the most foolish. I did not know then whether I was placing Ashcombe's future in capable hands or simply refusing to hand it to men I no longer trusted. regardless of what capability they might have possessed instead. "And now, uncle?" Eleanor asked softly. "Now," the Duke said, "I know precisely which it was. You have not merely managed this estate through its most dangerous season, Eleanor. You have shown its people, and shown me, what true and honest stewardship actually looks like. Something I fear Ashcombe had forgotten entirely, under Finch's long years of quiet theft. I am naming you steward in full, effective this very evening, not as a temporary arrangement born of illness and desperation, but as the rightful and permanent choice for this family's future, whatever objections certain relatives may continue to raise." Eleanor felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, months of exhaustion and quiet fear finally giving way to something warmer and far more settled. "Thank you, uncle. I promise you, I will not let this estate, or its people, fall into neglect again." Word of her formal appointment spread quickly through Ashcombe Hall and out across the surrounding tenant farms, and in the days that followed, Eleanor found herself greeted everywhere with a warmth that had been unimaginable during her first uncertain week at the estate. Even Mr. Pemberton, who had once stood squarely in her path outside the estate office door, sought her out with genuine congratulations, along with a quiet admission that he had rarely, in 20 years of practice, seen a more skillfully managed recovery from such thorough ruin. Edgar Ashcombe, for his part, made no further open challenge, though Eleanor suspected his resentment had not entirely faded, merely retreated beneath a surface, now too solid to easily crack. Lord Harcourt, still facing the slow unraveling consequences of the investigation into his dealings, offered no further attempts against Ashcombe's borders, his ambitions for the eastern fields finally and permanently extinguished. On a crisp evening at the close of the harvest season, Eleanor stood once more at the edge of the western field, watching the last golden light of the day settle over land that had nearly been lost entirely. Land now secure for a new generation of Ashcombe's tenants and family alike. She thought of her father, and of the small farm 2 counties away that had taught her everything she needed to know, long before she ever believed herself capable of saving an estate 50 times its size. The Duke had asked her, on that first desperate night, to act as his steward until harvest, uncertain whether such a thing was even possible. She had done far more than that. She had paid every debt, restored every broken trust, and rebuilt Ashcombe, not merely as numbers balanced neatly on a page, but as a living, thriving place, where honesty finally mattered more than pride, and where the people working its fields could trust, at long last, that their efforts would never again be quietly stolen away in the dark. As the last light faded gently behind the hills, Eleanor turned her horse toward Ashcombe Hall, riding home not as a stranger sent for in desperation, but as the woman who had truly saved it, and who intended, for many harvests still to come, to keep it standing strong.